Good afternoon. This is Dr. Long at Delro. This is a Cornell modified note-taking sheet that summarizes the insights from Charlie 172, the effective writing course in the C100 Foundations block. Our subject was the problem statement that we intend to use for the F100 paper, which will be turned in a final draft form in F101 for further work. So this summarizes the insights from two different areas on writing techniques and then also on force management content, which I'm calling the force management layups. And so I'll cover those second. The summary of the writing notes were common themes and advice across the board, and use them to help guide your thinking on writing. So the first idea is eliminating passive voice. Remember that people do things. Things are not done by people. We want to eliminate jargon and adjectives whenever possible. Adjectives rarely give us useful information in decision briefings. Define, then remember who they are, and then speak to the audience for your intended purpose. Always have them in mind and what it is that you want them to do, whether it's to take an action or to agree with your position. So define them, figure out what it takes to persuade them, keep that in mind, and then speak to them in active voice, and then write in that way. We give advice on bottom line up front a lot, but here's a way that you can think about doing that. See this a lot. Start with a draft paragraph that introduces you and your reader to the topic and then culminates in your thesis sentence. That's the golden thread that gets you from the general area all the way down to the thing you really want to say. Once you do that, then you're clear how there's a connection from the world to your recommendation. Then in your final draft, just start with that. I want you to imagine a world in which your audience knows all the things that you just said. So if you're writing for the Chief of Staff of the Army or a general officer, let's assume that they know all those things and don't need to be reminded, or they read it during the preview from their staff, and so they want to get right to the point. Remember that the general officers are strategic national assets with their focus and attention, so you don't want to waste that time, and trust that they know the background. That's what good staff work is. So start with that bottom line up front. Sir, the medical brigades in theater must have aerial robotic reconnaissance assets, or we fail our mission. Now you've made it clear what the point is going to be that you're going to then develop in your paper. Throughout the course F100 and writing in CGSC, discover and then use the professional language to be persuasive. So you need to know the example. For example, you need to know the difference between a requirement, a need, and a want. A requirement is something that unit or most units need in order to be successful on the battlefield across the range of military operations in multi-domain operations, or they're going to fail. That's what a requirement is. And that's different than saying that I need something or I want something. So I might want snipers in my infantry battalion, but we've survived for 50 years without an organic sniper team in the infantry battalion. So I want that, and I can argue why I need that for a particular operation or scenario, but I haven't established that that's a requirement for that kind of unit across the board in all mission profiles, or I'm going to fail. So to claim that something is a requirement requires a certain amount of evidence to establish that exceptional claim. We've talked about the Toolman model of argumentation as a way to construct your argument from pieces to ensure that your golden thread is complete and explicit. And then from that logical argument, you can test it for completeness and persuasiveness, and then use that to build the outline of your argument so that you can tell that story persuasively. So the Toolman table is a way to either unpack an argument to look for completeness an evaluation, or to construct your argument and illuminate the assumptions and the evidence that's required. While you're doing that Toolman table, use active verbs. Listen to the difference between our requirement to achieve dominance is, and the phrasing, to dominate we must. So it's better to say we dominate rather than in order to achieve dominance. When we talk about the golden thread, what I mean is the warrant, which is part of that Toolman table. You can think of the warrant as the justification for believing, the reasons to believe in that persuasive argument when I consider the chain of reasoning, the logical assumptions, the evidence that's offered, the relative power of the rebuttal versus your argument. When I take all those things together, I am making sense of the argument and finding it to be necessary and sufficient and complete. That's the golden thread that tells that story from start to finish, that leads me to the action that you propose. Remember to use parallel construction. So if I use the listing method of first, then I'm looking for second and third, or in the beginning, then in the middle, at the end. Be consistent in the way that you itemize and make that a deliberate, intentional act. The level of proof or evidence that's required for an argument depends on the consequences of the action recommended. So in the legal example, if capital punishment is what we're looking for, then the level of evidence that it takes to commit a judge to the taking of life is beyond a reasonable doubt. So depending on what it is that we want the judge to do, if it's a civil court, I don't need as much evidence. I maybe need only the preponderance of evidence or a majority of evidence. So we can think of different examples like, my evidence is incontrovertible. Not only is it true, it cannot be disproven or changed in the future because some timeless laws of the universe. Or the evidence may be unanimous, that all of the stakeholders polled are unanimously in favor of this idea. That's pretty powerful. Beyond a reasonable doubt, a preponderance of evidence, a majority of evidence, a sufficiency of evidence that is enough to allow me to consider this speculative course of action so that if it's wrong, the harm is not great and it's worth a try. So depending on the level of effort and the consequences of failure of that action may require different levels of evidence that you've got to be able to prove. So you may have listed legitimate facts and reasonable assumptions and conclusions, but it may not be persuasive enough. It may not be complete. It may not be sufficient in order to persuade the decision maker to get to that action. So understand that context. Let me shift over to key concepts. So word choice really does matter. It's the difference between lightning and the lightning bug. The choice of words in the example I gave before about requirement versus need versus want suggests different levels of effort or standards of evidence. Think of the use of jargon as a crutch. It's a shortcut that allows us to avoid thinking by looking for that catchphrase that we think has meaning, but it may not have meaning or precision outside of the general context. And when we're using professional language, we can communicate with the clarity and precision that we require in order to make military decisions. Implications and conclusions. So when I'm deconstructing the language, I'm looking for alternate explanations or trying to test different sense-making schemes to see what it is that you're actually asking. And sometimes the use of jargon causes us to provide filler, and it makes implications that we're not even aware of. I'd like you to think about the tendency to water down bold claims with hedging language. These hedges undercut the strength of our argument. They can create fog and uncertainty. Listen to the difference between these different phrases and see why word choice matters and how watering down claims can create uncertainty. You might say, this action is harmful, or this action is not helpful, or this action might not be useful. Three similar sounding phrases, but they have different levels of intention. They have different boundaries and constraints. So the extra thinking that it takes to go into the professional language to find exactly what it is that I want to convey is worth the effort because of the power that that precise word carries. Let me shift over to the content now for force management as a summary of some ideas. The context is this. In C200, you're going to hear about how we make strategy, disseminate strategy, how we compose strategy. Ultimately, strategy is provided to the geographic combatant commanders so that they can perform missions to achieve national objectives in their geographic region. To do that, they need ready forces. That same strategy drives the Army to produce ready forces for those GCCs. We might then ask, what does it have to be ready for? What do these forces have to do? What are the requirements? And therefore, what are the capabilities that I've created in order to achieve those requirements? The answer to that is force management. It has two main parts. Force design is the process that we use to design the capabilities to achieve those requirements at different echelons linked together by doctrine, which is internally consistent within the Army and the family of concepts, and which is nested within the joint operating concepts and the capstone concept for joint ops. ARCIC handles that for the Army to ensure that we have synchronized and integrated concepts. So that's force design. That expresses the models of organizations with capabilities that can achieve those requirements. Force integration, the second part, is usually easier for field officers to get because that's when you take those designed forces and piles of resources and make them ready. Force integration is how we integrate all those resources together to make that force ready to operate. So taken together, force design and force integration is how you get to force management. So the generating force is involved in the design and production of force design, and then the operating force uses resources to integrate the force. Now there's a seam where that generating force comes and provides assistance. It might be total package fielding or something like that. But force management composes those two major pieces. Now this next section are what I consider to be force management layups. These are the top-level concepts that you've got to be able to speak confidently, completely, and accurately about in 1 or 2 minutes in order to demonstrate proficiency with the broad body of knowledge. There's no practical force management question that you could be asked this year that's not going to involve some or all of these in some fashion. So having proficiency at these is like mastering layups with either hand under any circumstances in basketball. And this is a good way to warm up, a good way to build your finishing touch and start using those professional concepts professionally. .mil PF, a multi-purpose lens that allows us to systematically and in a disciplined manner analyze for gaps, evaluate solutions, estimate the kinds and quantities of changes that are required when new concepts come along. Multi-purpose lens that makes sure that we cover all of the essential domains and perspectives when building combat power. Cost, schedule, and performance, you can pick 2 out of those 3, but those are the dimensions of possible solutions. And they create the trade space when I take the minimum mission essential performance levels of cost, schedule, and performance. That creates the trade space within which feasible courses of action can be discussed with different levels of performance on key performance parameters so I can see what my real choices are, what I can choose from among. So the trade space is that space of all possible feasible solutions defined by the limits of minimum mission essential performance. PPB&E, the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system, is the capstone management process that brings all of our plans and operations together in a master management plan. It defines different time frames. It incorporates budget and key activities. When we update the Army campaign plan, it's expressed through the program and the budget and the execution and is informed by plans. So PPBE, that's the one ruling ring that binds all initiatives together. TAA, Total Army Analysis, an annual analytical process that the Army uses to update requirements by analyzing scenarios and enemies and testing variables, taking existing requirements and capabilities, evaluating different combinations of force structure across all of the components of the total force, testing new designs that were strong enough to be considered for competition for resources. It incorporates qualitative and quantitative analysis, so we do systematic, thorough, detailed supercomputer analysis of many different scenarios, and then we look at those proposed changes that come out of that through a qualitative lens in councils of colonels from the proponents and stakeholders, and then up to general officer steering committees, all the way up to the vice and the chief. And then from that, we define the program objective memorandum force, which is the blueprint expressed for resourcing throughout PPB&E. So that is the analytical lens that ensures that we are optimizing the force across the many different variables that we consider for the uncertain future. The FDU, or Force Design Update, is when proponents nominate changes to force structure designs with possible resourcing implications. The chief or the vice or the G3 approves those designs for unit capabilities for these organizational solutions as part of .mil-PF, and can decide if they're good enough to compete in TAA. Sometimes the concept is approved as a requirement, but it doesn't get to compete for resources because it's not high enough on the priority list. But the FDU is that multiple times a year when mature ideas for proposed changes in organizations are brought together, staffed through TRADOC and Futures Command, then out to the field, then up through the building to see if it's good enough to compete in TAA. So that's how we express new ideas in organizational form. Understand the difference between the generating force and the operating force that comes out of FM1. The operating force are those forces in the field that are ready to perform missions for GCCs in the nation. The generating force is that structure that the Army uses to produce those ready forces. Understand the roles of the proponents, those 2 stars down at centers of excellence, who represent warfighting functions and branches and are responsible for the management and caretaking and guidance of each of those. So the Chief of Infantry or Chief of the Maneuver Center of Excellence is responsible for those maneuver forces, all their doctrine, their .mil-PF elements, and the care and feeding of maneuver forces, or the signal, or protection. Proponents work for both Futures Command in the design, and then TRADOC in the development of doctrine, organization, training, leadership, personnel solutions. So those proponents are busy. The next section, the generating force, know who those MACOMs are, those major commands. Army Futures Command for the design. ARCIC, a subordinate command of Army Futures Command that is responsible for the doctrinal integration of the different centers of excellence and ensuring that Army concepts are internally consistent and then nested with the joint family of concepts. So that's the Army's designer. Proponents work for and through ARCIC and AFC, as well as responding to TRADOC as well. So that 2-star staff has to answer to both of those 4 stars, Army Futures Command and TRADOC. So TRADOC is responsible for the D, the T, elements of the O and the L, and some of the P, some of those ideas for managing their MOSs in .mil-PF solutions and developing requirements. Army Material Command manages the life cycle of materiel solutions and takes care of the entire readiness of those material solutions. Human Resources Command on the personnel and the manning, and then ForceCom receives those ready forces that have been resourced from each of those MACOMs and then produces the ready forces through training and makes them ready to deploy through Transcom to the GCCs. The 17 gaps are those elements that came out of the LSGCO study that CAC performed to identify the highest priority specific capabilities we need to get back to dominance in LSCO. They are collected underneath or organized under 6 modernization priorities, the 8 cross-functional teams that bind these things together in multi-functional teams to try to get integrated solutions. But those 17 gaps really are driving what our priorities are for immediate fixes to the force. Those are going to get expressed in PPB and E, and we'll see that later in F100. So that's the generating force major players that are designing and producing those ready forces for the GCCs to use. The next section talks about 2 important authorities and responsibilities that come from the Constitution through Congress. So you get the command line by law from the Constitution through Congress and the President, with command authority to the GCCs, who are joint war fighters that are responsible for developing plans and then implementing them to achieve the nation's objectives in their geographic region. That's the command line of authority. Congress also passes law in Title 10 and Title 32 to provide money and legal requirements to the services, and through Title 10, who are then responsible for support to services and then legal support to other services as defined by Title 10. That is called administrative control. And if you look over in the GCC, they have assigned to them an Army Service Component Commander of the 4-Star Senior Headquarters for that region, who's dual-hatted to respond to commands from the GCC for the operational units, and then the ADCON responsibility to provide support to all Army forces in that theater, and then Army support to other services as required by DoD or by law through Title 10. So that ASCC, with his dual hats, responds to both of those requirements and authorities. Each of those ASCCs also has a theater sustainment command who does the planning and operation of the sustainment portion of those plans and ops. That's the bridge between force management and the sustainment lessons that we'll talk about later. That's the planner and operator who's going to execute those sustainment plans. So that turns out to be pretty important because responsibilities and requirements can come from the command line as well as the ADCON line, and that helps us determine the forces that are actually required to fully implement those war plans. Finally, at the bottom, when we think about the Army plan, that's how the Army is going to respond to that strategy that is defined by senior leaders. It includes a report back to Congress and the President about how we're doing and what we're doing. It provides guidance internally through the Army Strategic Planning Guidance to planners at different MACOMs on how to develop the detailed plans to execute. And it is a report card on how we're doing. It communicates a vision. So the Army plan is how the chief ensures that what we've been told to do through strategy in response to requirements from GCCs, how we're going to get all that stuff done. That gets expressed through PPB and E. You can think of that. It comes at you in reverse order. The current year is the execution year. Then the next year is the budget year. Then 4 or 5 years of the program, and then planning beyond that to develop the ideas and concepts, which then get expressed through the program, which is a blueprint for how we intend to spend money, and we've committed money until such time as TAA or other decision processes cause us to change the shape, priorities, and implementing instructions for the Army plan. So PPB and E pulls all of those management and leadership initiatives together, puts budgets on them, and then becomes the blueprint for how we're going to execute the budget year and the execution year, informed by plans. So that's, in a nutshell, some of the layups that we'll see in force management. So we should have plenty of opportunities in F100 and through your paper and through our PEs to develop these ideas so that you have familiarity and confidence in using these top-level concepts together and weaving together stories in answer to specific questions. In the synthesis and the action notes areas are places you can be thinking about putting your questions that you think might be fair or follow-ups to yourself on actions to take. This will get you started. The next part of this package, I will go through the 16 initial papers offered by 15 Delta and illustrate how I analyze those, and it will have comments for both writing and force management ideas as a way to start taking on the understanding and implementation of these different chunks of knowledge. So thanks for your kind attention, and we'll see you in the classroom.